It is, it is amazing to, you know, this week they're going to celebrate 100 years of the DAC, and I think when you talk about design and interesting architecture, there's no better place in the city of Detroit that embodies, you know, history and the traditions of what really is great design. So all you have to do is look around this room. Jason and I were talking about that earlier. So on behalf of Automotive News, the APA, Michelin, it's my pleasure to be here with you and to get into some thought-provoking discussions on the future of design and on mobility for all, the next frontier. We did this a couple of years ago here, or I did it a couple of years ago. We had a wonderful conversation about the future of the vehicle, and I think today we take that kind of to a different step with the consideration of regions around the world, and considering that access to mobility is one of the cornerstones of economic and social progress, yet hundreds of millions of people lack that opportunity. So let's start, Ben, with the notion of picking this topic as a starting point. Why access to mobility in the future?
I mean, it typically, you know, we talk about mobility and we talk about performances of products and people desiring an object in the context of what we understand. You know, it's the context of, is it faster, is it more luxurious, you know, what are people wanting? And I think that as we look at a world that's moving toward areas that don't have the same needs that we do, we really identified that we need to figure out what those needs are. And we need to go forward with not just creating more of what we already have, but actually looking at creating something different. And before you can create something different, you really have to understand what are unique about the needs for people in these emerging zones, or like Alexander mentioned to me earlier, people right here in the US who have a large number of unmet mobility needs as well. And it's just such an interesting topic, and I think if we don't plan for it, then we will just continue to do what we do now, and we'll continue to manifest some of the problems that we have now with pollution and overcrowding and non-optimized solutions. And so it's very important for us to facilitate this discussion so we can start to understand how do we approach this in an intelligent way to actually meet the needs of people.
So for those who don't know, Jason, back to your line about thinking of something different, Jason challenges his crew every day at his Honda studio in California to not think of things that are exactly the same way. In fact, thinking of things that we already know is kind of against the rules in your own design studio, right, Jason?
It is. I mean, on a personal note, I remember thinking when I first went to, when I first graduated from Art Center, my first day driving to work from Pasadena, California to Torrance, which is about 23 miles door to door. And I remember being so excited that I'm really a car designer. I'm going to go design cars and being so excited about that. And it took me an hour to go 23 miles in my car.
Which was a short commute.
Which was a short commute. Right. And I started thinking about all the other things I could possibly do to get there quicker, like I could probably crawl quicker, or right, I could probably take a skateboard. But in all seriousness, I started thinking that, you know, I think that the definition of civilization is actually changing. And that I think that if I were to take that situation and that product and put it in that environment and paint that picture as a scenario and bring that to an investor today as a fresh idea and say, I want to show you this thing and I want you to invest in it, they'd think I was crazy because it makes no sense. In that situation, it makes no sense. And so I started thinking about not only how the definition of what mobility really means and how you can really advance mobility, but I also started thinking about how it was affecting people around the world, not just in Los Angeles, not just my situation, you know, complaining about driving to work, but like, what are the other options? And I knew that there were better options. And so for me, that was what actually got me excited about the next step in my career, which was really focused on what's after this, what's next.
So advanced design. Now your team is very different than your wife's team at Honda. And for those who don't know, Jason's wife is Michelle Christensen, who was the exterior designer on the NSX. She's working on today. Your teams at Honda Advanced Design are working 20 years down the road?
You know,
or at least on concepts?
Well, for me, I try to think about any good idea is worth doing now. And that maybe there's not a technology to back it up, or maybe there's not a market or the environment or the infrastructure isn't set up yet for it. But if it's a great idea, it's worth working on now. So I really don't think about years out, how far out something is, because if I could actually put my finger on what year that's going to be available, it would mean that I had 100% guarantee that I was going to be able to make it available on that day. And I think that all I can do is encourage my team of designers to think about ideas that are great for customers and great for, just the best possible idea. And if it's the best possible idea and you can get people to rally around that, then there'll always be somebody that could possibly populate that idea with a relevant technology or something to support that, to make it available for people. So I'm always thinking about what's next. I'm not thinking about what year it's for. I think that everything's possible.
Alex, what does mobility for all mean to you?
Yeah, I'm privileged. I hope this is not too loud. I'm privileged to basically every day work with 15 researchers in my classes and my program. And to support Jason's perspective, it's not so much about the years, it's about the progress, it's about what's next. But to get young individuals further outside of the box and not just do styling or do the next production design, it is very relevant to do research professionally. And that's what we teach. One part of our program is to do quantitative and qualitative research really in depth and very broad. And the privilege I have, I work basically every day with 15, almost all of my students are coming out of this concentrated area you're focusing on, where there's such a huge population, which is China, which is India, which is South Korea. And I'm listening a lot to how they got raised and how are they mobile. And the brutal reality is almost no one of them has a driver's license for a car. Some of them had a motorcycle in their life. They don't have a driver's license right now, and they're in Detroit's Midtown area, mobile with bicycles and walking by feet, or using a zip car or using Uber if they want to go to the airport. So for them, it's really part of their existence, part of their growing into their profession, and they do this every day. So I'm privileged to learn from their cultural background of mobility, and that makes me think often about what is the needs we collected throughout our human evolution, right? Like, where did this start? And basically, I read a very, very scary word. You know, the Germans have always those scary words, like Krankenwagen instead of ambulance, just like ambulance. And so I read a new word when I traveled to Geneva last month, and that was Raumüberwindung. And I was like, wow, which doesn't mean anything different than overcoming space. And it was described as that when we lived around dinosaurs, we were not top of the food chain. And so we had to survive with our families in caves and protected because our organic strength was not on par with the animals around us. So we were very fragile, and we were really in the need of moving from cave to cave over space, which exposed us to those hunters because they needed to live. So that kept us mobile. And so the nomads were like moving, bigger groups of same people around. And America, a good example as well. 300 years ago, settlers were moving with settler tracks and powered by horses and the wheel around. And that's why I'm so happy to be here today with one of the business owners of enabling us with mobility, which is the wheel with Michelin. And I think that on the Maslow pyramid of needs, what we as human beings have, we consider a lot in our established world to think about how can we express our social status and our self-confidence in this high level. But to your point, and that's why I like the topic so much, mobility for all, there's still people fighting every day to survive with water needs, with going to places where there is water, or selling their harvested fruits to sell them. And they're challenged every day by climate disasters. So in our research, we collect a lot of all of those data, and nothing new are those charts for our students. And so we look into the future from a very optimistic perspective. Like designers wanted to create beautiful, functional devices or vehicles, and as we all know, we are challenged with the infrastructure today. And
we have to be practical with that too, right? So
practical, but also we have to own it today. In the future, potentially, it's not about the owning, it's about the using of those vehicles, which potentially is a big paradigm shift.
Ben, what do you say about the practicalities of unserved areas right now? What needs to be considered when we look at mobility in some of these emerging markets?
I think what's really interesting, to a point that Jason made earlier, where I think that we often associate innovation with a technology, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea, is you come up with something, you know, that's a technology, and you say that was the true innovation. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. I mean, whenever Jason was talking about setting up scenarios, he discussed setting up a scenario, and you have the belief that you will discover the technology to facilitate that, right?
Right.
And so I think what's really important is, as we're considering these underserved areas, we have to consider the scenario without saying, do we have the technology necessary in our pocket right now, right? Is the maturity level there? Those sorts of things. I think that we have to consider the core issues. You know, one of them, Alexander, that you mentioned is, there's some statistics that say that 30% of the food grown in developing countries never makes it to a place where people can purchase it. You know, it's lost somewhere along the way, whether it's in the field or in transportation. So it's not just mobility of people, it's also mobility of goods. And so if there was a scenario in which you could imagine, how could we get food to people, right? That's not necessarily a moving people, but you're taking, so there's a mobility of people, but there's also mobility of goods to people as well. And so I think those scenarios like that are really where we find the Challenge program providing us a lot of insight into challenges that people are facing around the world in that way.
Jason, when you look at mobility in the future, what are the key concepts that you're focusing on right now? I know it's difficult for folks to envision the future more further out than what they currently have, right? But you used an example of the Tron bike, for example, the Tron cycle during our conversation earlier.
I think that, you know, to Ben's point, I think the idea is really to try to start to really honestly look at people's situation and look at what their situation is now, and then try to think about what possible scenarios are there going to be in the future. If you could paint a picture of what it looks like in the future, and you can say 20 years or 30 years for the sake of argument, but if you could actually create scenarios that you think are positive scenarios, optimistic scenarios. This isn't doomsday scenarios. These are all positive, optimistic scenarios. And you paint those pictures, and you use those scenarios in order to then use as almost a foundation or a template or a map that you would then populate with products or services that then you can try to figure out how much value those could possibly have. It's like what you want to do is kind of almost simulate what it might be like within a system, because I think that a lot of us are so stuck on products, the actual product, but what they don't realize is that a successful mobility solution is a system. It might be a product, it might be a service, it might be something else, but it has to work efficiently within that system. That's what makes it successful, not a product.
But how much control do you have over that? I mean, you're a car company.
You're never sure.
Right.
You have to be 100% confident, but you don't have to be 100% sure that something's going to be successful, because all you can do is guess about what these, and take an educated guess about what possible scenarios will take place in the future. And it's a great way, actually, in our studio, and it's something that we do, is that we first create the scenario before the designers are designing an actual thing. We create scenarios that we believe in, that we're excited about, and then we have the designers populate those scenarios.
So give us an example of that. What's an example of a scenario that you would have created?
For example, you can think about where there's constant talk about, let's talk about LA, because that's what I've been dealing with recently.
We want you to have mobility, Jason,
yes,
for all.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I keep saying, I know, it's not just for LA.
Yeah.
You start to think about the conversation about autonomous cars. We talk about this all the time. And there's always the what ifs all the negative things that you think about. The first things you start thinking about are the fears associated with not being in control, all those things. But that's very much focused on the product. So what we start thinking about is, what are the possible scenarios? What happens if, in the future, computers are driving cars around for you? If that's the case, then what do you need 6 lanes of traffic for? What happens if all of a sudden that valuable real estate that in downtown LA on the 10 freeway or the 101, just the real estate in downtown LA is $10 million an acre? I wonder what would happen if all we needed was 2 lanes, one for mass goods, one for commerce, one for transportation. What happens if all of a sudden all of those lanes, other lanes of traffic are used for farming, if they're used for warehousing, if they're used for other things? So, I mean, I'm just talking about a little corner piece of the scenario, but when you start to chase this around, you start to realize that it's a bigger system, that it's something you have to think about all the benefits that could go along with these kind of what-if scenarios.
Alex, when you talk to your students about designing for the future, and you look at things like infrastructure or cost or service and repair maintenance, are those all factors that you take into consideration?
Yeah, totally. I have a good scenario as well. It's a thesis of a student right now. And we actually came to a pretty hard debate about, is that solution he comes up with, is that part of transportation design, or is it part of architecture, or is it part of product design, or what is it experience design, what is it? And the creation of, or the thought, his idea is happening in the mega cities in Shanghai or in China, Shanghai, Beijing today, where a lot of people, even just one family member, moves from the countryside into the big cities and works potentially 16 hours and to provide for the family at home. So he will travel potentially every 2nd month, every 3rd month, every quarter back to his family to see the family. And based on his stress those workers have there, they're potentially at the verge of going ill. Because they live in an apartment not bigger than your king-size bed today at home. And so the psychological pressure is so big that they want to be in contact with the family they love to share their pressure to not kill themselves, right? So he comes up with the idea that there is let's say an architectural structure in certain areas where instead of driving on the weekend where everyone wanted to leave the big city, and this is a huge congestion and spending hours just to get through there or to go out for 100 miles, there's a space where he can go, or where those can go, to be through virtual reality connected to their family, and all the holographic technology which is coming in the virtual reality we see in movies. If that's real, the family can meet and they can talk, and they together could travel into places where they have an experience together without moving physically, basically, the mass around. So the question is, if that capsule, if that space has clean air, what they all try to run out from these mega cities, and it actually is very accessible, very few, is that part of transportation in the future? Is that what transportation designers need to think about to create a virtual travel, a virtual mobility?
And your students spend half the time, from what I understand, on research, and half the time on air, actually. And not air as in clean, livable air, but as in airspace.
Exactly.
Correct?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's all part of the same thing.
Yeah, because when you think about it, Michelin is one of the enablers of rolling and have the wheels, but also this invention brought us to those big cities Jason is talking about, that we stand in traffic jams. So the next frontier potentially is the airspace, if we find a way to control this airspace. And we have examples today where, if you look at the quadcopters and those multicopters flying around with thruster rings, they look like circles, they look like wheels. So going up into air is that potentially a frontier for Michelin to go into if mobility happens in the future, also using air and controlled air. And autonomous technology is well known in the aerospace today. Maybe an easier way to control this.
It's interesting because, I mean, these are the types of scenarios that we talk about all the time, right? And I think that what always makes it so difficult for people that are focused on making product that's just for today or just for short periods out for tomorrow is showing them what it looks like, the world. So sometimes you can take a product like that and you can take that product and you could just sit it on the street right outside here next to all the cars from today and yesterday. And what's going to happen is everybody's going to point at it and say, that's crazy, and they'll walk away. Because it's really, really hard to understand what's the scenario. How is it in context? How's this going to apply to me?
That currently happens with a BMW i8.
Exactly, which is good.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what happens, and this is the type of thing that I think that is one thing that we all believe in terms of what really represents good design for the future is allowing people to see these ideas in context and painting that picture around it so that not only does that product not look crazy, but it looks comfortable and it makes a lot of sense.
Does that mean we're going to see some more Honda vehicles on the road that are perhaps a little more forward-looking?
You never know.
Right.
You know, what's interesting to me listening to this conversation, and what I think about a lot is that businesses can no longer live in a vacuum. You know, and expertise can no longer exist. I mean, you hear about scenarios and this company interacting with that company, and how do we create this larger picture? And I think what we're ending up with is you have some really strange bedfellows. You know, I mean, you realize that like this coming together today, you know, you really have to not just sit in your studio and say, okay, between 8 and 5, you're going to think the future, go. Right. You know, I mean, you have to really go out and make some partnerships that in the past may have seemed not as natural, you know, and because everybody really has a stake in this game to how do we, like you talk about, an optimistic future. And it doesn't just involve the next Honda car, and it doesn't just involve the next graduate from CCS. It really involves bringing together multiple, what at Michelin we call métiers, of people to collaboratively solve these problems.
So, Ben, just to stay with you, and when we looked at the map, you know, to start this whole conversation, we looked at Southeast Asia, we looked at Central America, we looked at Central Africa. Mm-hmm. What's Michelin doing? How is Michelin thinking of those areas, and how will you serve them differently than how these areas are served here?
Well, I guess to Jason's answer, you'll see, you know, but I think that what we're discovering is that we oftentimes, it's not a question of scaling, right? It's not a question of building another factory to create what is appropriate for the U.S. market and just saying, since we know how to do that, we're going to sell those all over the world. You know, I think in these areas, the challenges around durability and our core strengths of longevity and fuel economy, those remain. But I think that you're discovering that an optimization of the product for each of these zones is a good thing, because they have a different set of needs.
Well, durability in a country like India, for example, obviously a huge issue. Infrastructure changes.
That's a huge issue.
Right.
And that's a huge issue in any of these emerging zones, because the last thing that gets optimized is the infrastructure, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you can basically guarantee in all of this slide that Scott showed, where there's the lowest amount of cars per capita, the roads are the worst, right? Because you're not collecting taxes from selling a lot of gas, that sort of thing. And so whenever you go into those emerging zones, you know, that durability and that is always going to be something that's going to be very important, you know.
Jason, when you think about features that you would design into a vehicle for an underserved region, what do you consider? Size, weight, repairability? What are the factors that go into that?
I think the first thing that I would consider is who these people are and what they want and what they need. And that would be the only determining factor from there, that everything would trickle off from there. It's very easy for us to look at emerging markets and say, well, we've made cars for 100 years. We've been making these products. We know what you want. That's very easy to do that. But we've seen that mistake made before. We've seen people say, they want a cheap car in China, and then what they really want is something big and something that seems luxurious and something somewhat traditional, and all of a sudden people's mind change, right? So I don't think about features, because if I start thinking about features, I start thinking about features that I want, or I start relating it to me. And what I really want to do is take the mirror and turn it around and put it toward those people in those markets and figure out what they want and have them tell us what features are needed, what they really want, what's really necessary, and then that's when we start to create from there.
So there's a big part of innovation I think that we haven't touched on yet is how do you make these things? You know, I mean, we all just kind of say, oh, this bottle, this water, and you talk about the thing, right. You got to make this somehow, right? Mm-hmm. And so as you talk about mobility solutions in emerging zones, one thing we have to be very careful of is how is this thing being constructed? You know, I mean, I think there's an opportunity for innovation in the actual construction of the solution that you don't necessarily see, but that may actually have a bigger impact than what the device actually is.
Well, it's funny too, because when I heard mobility for all and I thought about the traditional automotive industry and in terms of the mass manufacturing of products, in terms of stamping, in terms of making molds, in terms of how you actually manufacture a product. And the new technologies available to us today in terms of 3D printing, in terms of rapid manufacturing, in terms of all that, you start not thinking, well, maybe mobility for all doesn't mean one thing for everybody. Maybe it means everybody has one thing. Or it means everything can be designed for that individual, or even one product could be designed for just a small group or a small village just to fit their specific needs, the customizability and all of those things that we're starting to see in this industry and other industries.
And various other industries, right?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I think also to Ben's point is like to produce means that we were privileged to use a lot of steel over 120 years and don't even recycle it really on a high level. The rates are still around 5% what we recycle, what we use as material, we forget about it. Instead of owning this material, if Michelin would say like, no, we want to own our rubber, we want to own our tires, and we want to keep this tires material around for the next 100 years, the business model or the ownership model will potentially change. Same with cars. If you look at airplanes from Boeing, they're engineered to be 30, 40 years around with this material spent, and they're still good. They get updated and upgraded and serviced so long, and the airlines make business with that. So I think that we see this already coming where rental car companies, using the cars we produce for the personal use, and then they sleep 23 hours, but they use them 24 hours a day throughout the year to make business with that. In the future, where our next generation might not have the money, or in certain markets there's not enough money, those machines could run 24/7 and being used 24/7, where it's not the ownership model, is someone is really mobile by using those. And what would be the material or the machine then? Would it be way more higher graded? Like if you look, the best example is always a Rolls-Royce, right? Potentially you will have not a chance to find a Rolls-Royce on a junkyard, right? Because they get all kept alive and refurbished and rebuilt, and they're the most valuable cars today. So that's as a pattern, if you have the right materials and the right solid, robust engineering behind it, why wouldn't we keep those carbon fiber shells, and why wouldn't we keep those high-strength steels longer used and utilized over time in products? That's the big question. So that's one of the paradigms we're cracking right now.
Alexander, do you think that existing OEMs are going to have the most success in mobilizing these underserved areas, or is it going to be more organic with local companies?
I think the potential of the existing OEMs today is the biggest, because they know all homologation rules and regulations to test. They have the best engineers, the best system understanding, the infrastructure understanding, the business models. But by all knowing this, we also see examples that it's very difficult to reinvent if you're part of the problem, right? To find this next solution is potentially coming from the outside. And Einstein said that if you're part of this problem team, you might not reinvent your solution, because you know exactly why it has to be like this. So potentially it will be startups and grassroots companies and communities in Africa or in China or in India or in Vietnam or in Colombia, which come up with ideas based potentially on the level of what is growing and regrowing as material there. Maybe bamboo, maybe wood, where we will hopefully have the sun around for a longer time. So the sun is renewably producing those materials what can be used. It will be tires needed which maybe are not pneumatic, because if there's no air in the tire, you might not go, you know, and so you leave it. So there's two-wheel or other inventions you have already. There's maybe other materials, other processes to generate wheels in the future, and then let people come up with vehicles they can use.
Jason, are you exploring other materials for other markets? Are you going into some of these areas that Alex mentioned?
I mean, we're always trying to start as though we're starting from scratch. I mean, you know, it's a challenge to do that, but you have to separate yourself from what you already know, because it's very comfortable to try to call it a revolution when it's really evolution. And I think that for us, we're always looking at new materials, always looking at new manufacturing methods, always looking at ways to recycle things, always looking at ways to have one thing have two uses, not just one use or multiple uses. And so we're always looking into that. I mean, a few years ago we were focusing on vegetable-based plastic panels and things like that, you know, and this was for a concept. And you know, there's a lot to be done with all these different materials. It's just that you have to separate yourself from what you already know and then move on from there, because there's so many options.
That's a hard task. Separate yourself from what you already know, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, it is.
That's one of the biggest keys to, I think, a successful designer there. You know, I mean, I think the least successful designer is the person that only makes things for themselves, right? I mean, and the most successful designer is someone who their entire career creates nothing but things that they don't personally care for, right?
I mean, earlier we were talking about it, and we were saying, you know, that, like, especially like in advanced design, I'm always told, you know, people will tell me that what we're doing is sometimes uncomfortable, and I say that's good. That means we're doing our job.
Yeah, that's your mission, right?
Because if you're too comfortable, it means you're not pushing the limit enough. It means you're not taking the risks. So we were joking around about that a little bit earlier, but I mean, I think that's where the best designs, the best solutions come from. Not that obvious place. It's coming from somewhere else.
And it's interesting that you say this, sorry, Ben. Uncomfortable, that's what I tell every student every day. You know, if you don't, my job is to make you uncomfortable, because only when you feel uncomfortable, you're going to learn.
Right.
Yep.
And so I think that's part of the madness, what designers are going into. They feel a lot of times uncomfortable because they also don't learn the physics behind certain things. So they believe how things work on a functional level, and that belief enables them to think a little bit different than it actually happens. An engineer would never think like this. So this ability of not thinking linear like an engineer enables the designers. That's why I enjoy so much the design challenge, because this is people who invent. And I'm not sure if the Wright brothers were inventors, or they weren't inventors, but if they were engineers or designers, and it didn't matter. They had a dream, and they wanted to fly, and they just did it. And they found paper and wood, and they went out. And I'm looking for the inventors of the future. That's why our program is about inventing, the designer's inventor, you know, to just push out the limits and figure it out.
That's kind of the power of not knowing what you don't know,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
and that's the reason that I'm sure you always look for new designers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and why it's important for us in the challenge program to constantly, you know, ask questions of people who have never been asked that question before. They don't know any better, so therefore they don't have the restrictions that all of us carry in our everyday life whenever
Right.
we said,
Right.
last time we tried that, it was a terrible idea.
Right.
You know?
And it's problem solving, right? I mean, at the end, it comes down to solve problems, observe the problem, and come up with new ideas to solve the problem.
Well, and you kind of want those tormented thoughts. You know, you want the tormented designers. You want the people that are themselves unhappy with the way things are.
Right.
And that's because that's what's going to make the change.
Yeah.
Is you want people that look around themselves and they say, this could be better. There's a better option, and constantly having that itch to make it better, to do something new.
Jason, describe the makeup of your team in California. You know, Alexander talked about the makeup of his students and how it is truly a global class that you teach now, and how important the belief system and the culture, or the cultural differences, are to the makeup of your team.
Well, I like to have a lot of people that whenever we're bringing in a new member, we have our, we're looking at the general makeup of my own team, I like to have a lot of people that disagree with each other. I want to make sure that there's a constant respect for different opinions.
But a tension point.
Huh?
But a tension
there
point.
always has to be a tension point, of course. It's designers, it's emotional, you know, everybody's got to have. But I think that when you look at the makeup, for me, I'm not looking at it like a traditional design studio where I hire a bunch of guys that are good at drawing cars. Because that's great for a production studio and that's great for styling. But what we're thinking about is from the product from the ground up, from what happens from the inside out. So what I'm thinking about is real design, not styling. It's beyond styling. Styling is just a portion of design. But so I try to hire people with various backgrounds, people that are not just focused on styling. They have to be, maybe they come from a product design background, maybe they've got some even engineering background, sometimes they have...
from my program.
From his program.
Yeah, there you go.
From his program.
That was a pitch.
A little plug there. Yeah.
Got it.
He'll be
Let me give
taking
you my
applications
card.
Half
later.
a guy, half a
Yeah.
guy from Broad. You know, and so I guess I'm really looking for people with varied backgrounds that have a different perspective, that aren't exactly happy with the status quo, that are looking to change things and have that itch, that burning desire to look for something new and do something new. And so if you were to ask everybody in my studio, I mean, I've got one guy that's going to go work in Cirque du Soleil for a couple months and be flying kites. I mean, these guys have crazy hobbies, and they're integrated into their communities. They're integrated into the world around them, and they're all observant. And that's the kind of people that we need in design studios now. You can't just be good at drawing cars.
Nationalities? What nationalities do you?
Oh, we have French, we have German, we have just for you, and then we have Koreans. I mean, we've got.
You have somebody from Renault. You have somebody from. I mean, this is across.
We've had guys that have worked at Renault and
Yeah.
Peugeot, and I like that. It means that it's a real melting pot.
Ben, when you look toward the future and you think about, say, messaging in underserved areas, how important is it to go in and say, you know, now you have an affordable car versus now we have something that's going to protect you or that's going to provide mobility? How important is that?
I didn't realize how important it was until I actually talked to Alexander, and we had a really interesting discussion about some of the less successful automotive endeavors in India, and the fact that if you were to look at it from an academic perspective, you have a need, you created a product, it answered the need, therefore it should have been perfect, right? And so I think the messaging is vital in that, if you, let's say that the biggest need people have is for affordable vehicle, right? That you don't, the message is not, this is a cheap car. You know, because then when you have it, everyone goes, oh, poor Alexander, he doesn't make much money, he can only afford the cheapest car. And instead, you know, you message it with the things that it does well, right? Where instead of having low price, it has high value. Right. And those are very different messages. And I think in our modern connected world, we can no longer just throw something out and say, here, this is what we think you guys need. It solves the problem that we observe perfectly. And instead, you need to go in there with an appropriate message that says, we heard you, we understood you, this is something to solve that need, but the value proposition is very different than, look, this is cheap. And I'm not sure if, you know, the Volkswagen Beetle and the Citroën Deux Chevaux and these things that were so target made to be made inexpensively and sold to people that didn't have a lot of means and now have become kind of cult figures and, you know, great objects, I'm not sure if that can be repeated.
But let's look at the example of the Nano, right? Which
that's right, and that's the one that
story.
wasn't as successful.
Right.
In a lot of ways, the Nano is a huge success. I mean, when you look at how it's made, when you look at the choices, you know, that they can actually build it to that price point, it's incredibly successful. But that's a perfect example of my perception is the messaging could have really helped that car. And I'm not sure if it's recoverable because I think that the population it was designed for saw it in a way that they didn't see that as something they wanted to own, something they had to have, even though it probably was a great way to meet their needs.
Well, I think that's interesting too, is in terms of allowing the customers to be involved in the process of shaping whatever this mobility world is. and allowing them to feel like they're a part of the creative process in some sort of way. I'm not saying let them design the cars. I'm saying
that's where you get the Homer Simpson mobile, right?
Of course. But what I'm saying is that I think that people now with the internet and being able to, and social media and being able to get involved in seeing the process and a lot of the process of creating products, not just in the automotive industry, but with across the board, you see a lot more transparency. People are understanding things a little bit more. And so you can't push a message. It has to be authentic. And so because it has to be authentic and it has to have that honesty to it, it means that they have to be involved. And there has to be a transparency in order to get the best product out there. We all see the best products are the ones that people put out there and they're honest and they have integrity. And they're the ones that aren't, there's no messaging. There's maybe messaging, but the messaging doesn't have to be forced. It's clear, it's instinctual.
An interesting value I learned last year when I was in India, and I shared a little bit my experience out of this traffic. Well, one major element I haven't considered, and potentially most of you consider this as well, modern vehicles today, we are not able to fix them, but we all, at least the male of us, we like to tinker around and fix certain things and change the tire and just the valves and stuff, right? Like it's what we all grew up with. A lot of those values and those connections, not to need a mechanic or a service station to fix my vehicle, is very relevant in India, for example. That's why all the scooters, the motorcycles they have, they need to be, from a technological point of view, as basic as possible so that the father and the family can fix the vehicle. So now with the Nano in there, potentially they face the situation, I potentially cannot fix this vehicle, so it's not valuable to me because I would, and it is enclosed, so it's always, from a climate perspective, it's always hot and very humid in India. So I need to run all this air conditioning all the time, which takes away from, adds to the consumption, and I don't have enough money actually to always drive around with a 5-seater vehicle while I'm driving to work alone. But in the evening when I go with a family, I put them all on my motorcycle, and I cannot wear a helmet because I need to listen to all the horns behind me who want to take me over. So it's a very intense experience I had last year in India, but it comes to the point, you need to observe what's the reality, and I recommend it. I met someone in a governmental position over there, and I recommended not to build or not to follow the pattern what the Chinese government did of like building cars and make everyone mobile, because potentially they also congest the cities and everyone is not able to move anymore to their jobs, and they lose their jobs. So another pattern and that's my biggest capital, what I see, what I have through my role at CCS is really having Indian students there. So I learned as well that factories are timed, like a lot of our commute has to do with our job. We all have to be there kind of like 8 o'clock, right? The big factories in India are scheduled. So one factory starts at 7, the other one starts at 8, the other one starts at 9, the other one starts at 10. So the congestion is limited so that the flow is guaranteed so that everyone can get to their factory not at one rush hour all the time. And that brings it to the point, how will we work in the future? What's our commute? Because a lot of the choices we make today in terms of cars is based around that everyday need to commute, right?
Based on a very traditional view. Yeah, your 23-mile commute that takes 2 hours.
Exactly.
I just want to make sure.
But the vehicle is able to drive with 5 people, fully loud stereo system, safely from here to Florida every day, and is that the right choice? Right. So I think there should be just more options, more choices we should have, additionally to the ownership model. Do we need to own everything, or would we use certain things and own other things?
Jason, final word before I throw it out to the crowd?
Well, I was just going to say that it really comes down to the fact that when you think about man from the beginning until now, and you think about societies and economies, and you think about the difference between the ones that could survive or merely survive and the ones that actually thrive, it has to do with advancement in mobility. That's a core element to advancing civilization. And so we can't be just okay with surviving. We want to be able to thrive, and we want to help other markets to thrive.
Michelin, a better way forward.